The screech of metal against metal shattered the morning silence as Karen's pristine SUV collided with Marcus's parked Honda, but when she stepped out, adjusting her designer sunglasses with the entitled smirk of someone who'd never faced real consequences, Marcus had no idea he was about to witness the most spectacular fall from grace his quiet neighborhood had ever seen. What started as a simple fender bender would the morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Grove Drive. As Marcus Chen loaded his toolbox into the back of his Honda Civic, at 30, he'd learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the chaos of another day, fixing broken pipes and faulty wiring. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent his days repairing other people's problems while his own life felt perpetually under construction. He was reaching for his coffee mug when the world exploded into screeching tires and crushing metal. The impact sent his car lurching forward 3 feet, the rear bumper crumpling like aluminum foil. Marcus spun around to see a gleaming white Escalade, its front end now intimately acquainted with his Honda's back. Steam hissed from the SUV's radiator as the driver's door swung open. Out stepped Karen Whitmore. Even in crisis, she moved with the calculated precision of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Her platinum blonde hair remained perfectly styled despite the collision, and her designer workout clothes, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, bore not a single wrinkle. She adjusted her oversized Chanel sunglasses and surveyed the damage, with the detached interest of someone examining a mildly disappointing restaurant meal. "Well, this is just fantastic," she muttered, her voice carrying the particular brand of exasperation reserved for minor inconveniences that dared interrupt her carefully orchestrated day. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, coffee mug still in hand, processing what had just happened. His car, his reliable, paid off, absolutely could not afford to replace Honda sat mangled in front of him. The rear bumper hung at an unnatural angle, the trunk wouldn't close, and what appeared to be transmission fluid was pooling on the pristine asphalt. "Are you okay?" he called out, muscle memory kicking in despite his shock. His mother had raised him right, even if the woman who'd just destroyed his car clearly operated by different rules. Karen waved dismissively without looking at him, already pulling out her phone. "I'm fine, though my car certainly isn't, thanks to this whole situation." Thanks to this whole situation? Marcus blinked, certain he'd misheard. He approached carefully, noting the way Karen positioned herself between him and her vehicle, as if he might somehow contaminate it further. "Ma'am, you hit my parked car," he said, keeping his voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I was loading my equipment when—" "Excuse me?" Karen's head snapped up, and even through her sunglasses, Marcus could feel the weight of her incredulous stare. "Your car was parked illegally. This entire situation could have been avoided if you'd followed basic community guidelines." Marcus glanced around, confused. He was parked directly in front of his own house, exactly where he parked every single day for the past 3 years. The street was wide enough for 2 lanes of traffic with parking on both sides. There were no signs, no painted curbs, nothing remotely suggesting his parking was problematic. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," he said, approaching the rear of his Honda to assess the damage. Up close, it was worse than he'd initially thought. The impact had pushed the trunk into the back seat area, and something that looked expensive was leaking steadily onto the street. "This is in front of my house. I've parked here every day since I moved in." Karen's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, you live here? In the rental?" She spoke the word rental like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "That explains everything." The casual cruelty in her tone hit Marcus harder than the actual collision. He'd grown up in apartments, bounced between rentals for most of his adult life, and finally managed to rent a small house in what seemed like a decent neighborhood. He wasn't ashamed of renting, was all he could afford while building his handyman business and paying off his father's medical bills. But something about Karen's tone made him feel like he should be. "Look," Marcus said, pulling out his phone. "Let's just exchange insurance information and insurance." Karen's voice pitched higher. "Do you have any idea what my deductible is? This is going to cost thousands to repair, and frankly, I don't think your insurance is going to cover the full extent of the damage." Marcus stared at her, genuinely confused. "Your insurance should cover it since you hit me. That's how insurance works. I hit you because you were parked illegally." Karen's voice took on the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a particularly slow child. "The community guidelines clearly state that parking on the street creates hazardous conditions and compromises the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. This accident happened because you violated those guidelines." "What community guidelines?" Marcus felt like he'd stumbled into an alternate reality where basic traffic laws didn't apply. "This is a public street. I live here. I'm allowed to park in front of my own house." Karen sighed dramatically and began scrolling through her phone. "Obviously, you didn't read the homeowners association documents when you moved in. Though I suppose renters don't typically bother with such things." "There's no HOA here," Marcus said firmly. He'd specifically chosen this neighborhood because it didn't have the kind of restrictive covenants that came with homeowners associations. "I checked before I signed my lease." "There absolutely is," Karen replied without looking up from her phone. "I should know I'm the president." And according to Section 4.2 of our community standards, street parking is prohibited except for brief loading and unloading periods. Your car has been here overnight, which constitutes a clear violation. Marcus felt the conversation spiraling into absurdity. Ma'am, with all due respect, you can't just declare yourself the president of a non-existent HOA. This is a regular residential street with no parking restrictions. Karen's head tilted slightly, and he caught a glimpse of her eyes over her sunglasses. They were cold, calculating, and completely certain of their own authority. Young man, she said, her voice dropping to the tone reserved for addressing particularly insubordinate employees, I've lived in this neighborhood for 12 years. My husband and I own the largest property on the street. We've invested considerable time and money into maintaining the community standards that keep property values high and ensure this remains a desirable place to live. She gestured vaguely at Marcus's damaged Honda. Cars like this, parked permanently on the street, create an atmosphere of transience. They suggest that the community doesn't take pride in its appearance. That's exactly the kind of thing that drives down property values for everyone. The casual bigotry in her words was so matter-of-fact that it took Marcus a moment to process it fully. She wasn't just trying to avoid responsibility for the accident, she genuinely believed his presence in the neighborhood was inherently problematic. Are you seriously suggesting that I caused this accident by existing in my own neighborhood? Marcus asked, his professional calm finally beginning to crack. I'm suggesting, Karen replied, that this accident wouldn't have happened if you'd followed proper community standards. Now, I'm prepared to be reasonable about this. If you're willing to acknowledge that your parking violation contributed to this incident, we can work out a payment plan for the damages to my vehicle. Marcus stared at her, speechless. The audacity was breathtaking. She'd hid his parked car, invented an imaginary HOA to justify it, and was now demanding he pay her for the privilege of being rear-ended. Lady, he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. You hit my car. You are liable for the damages. That's not negotiable. Karen's expression hardened. I see. So you're going to be difficult about this. She turned away from him and placed a call, her voice immediately shifting to the practiced tones of someone accustomed to getting her way through complaints and demands. Hi, this is Karen Whitmore on Maple Grove Drive. I need to report a parking violation and a traffic incident. Yes, I'll hold. While she spoke, Marcus walked around to examine her SUV. The front end was crumpled, the headlight was shattered, and fluid was leaking from multiple locations. It was easily several $1,000s in damage, possibly enough to total his Honda if the frame was bent. But something else caught his attention. The Escalade's front bumper bore scrape marks that looked older than this morning's collision. Paint from at least 2 different colored vehicles was embedded in the damaged plastic, and the passenger side had dents that clearly predated today's incident. Officer, I'm standing here next to a vehicle that's been parked illegally on our street for months, Karen was saying into her phone. The owner is being extremely uncooperative about resolving this according to community standards. Yes, I understand you'll send someone out. She ended the call and turned back to Marcus with a satisfied smile. The police are on their way. I'm sure once they see the situation, they'll understand exactly what happened. 3 hours after the collision, Marcus was still dealing with the aftermath when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but the voice on the other end was unmistakably Karen Whitmore, though it sounded different now, smaller, more desperate. We need to talk, she said without preamble. Meet me at Starbucks on 5th Street in 20 minutes. I don't think we have anything to please. The word came out cracked. Vulnerable. You don't understand what's happening, what you've done. Marcus almost hung up, but something in her tone stopped him. This wasn't the imperious woman who demanded he pay for her repairs. This was someone who sounded genuinely terrified. 25 minutes later, he found Karen in a corner booth. Her designer sunglasses finally removed to reveal red-rimmed eyes and smeared mascara. The perfect facade was cracking, and what lay beneath looked raw and desperate. Thank you for coming, she said as he sat down across from her. Her hands shook slightly as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. I know you don't owe me anything, but I need you to understand something about this morning. What I understand, Marcus said carefully, is that you hit my car and then tried to make it my fault. Karen flinched. I know how it looked. I know how I sounded, but you have to believe me, I wasn't trying to hurt you. I was trying to protect myself. From what? A minor traffic accident. From my husband finding out I crashed the car. The words tumbled out in a rush. From him asking questions about where I was going, why I was driving so fast, why I wasn't paying attention. Marcus studied her face, noting the way she kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in. Why would that be a problem? Karen laughed, but there was no humor in it. Because I was leaving the bank. Because I'd just withdrawn $20,000 in cash. Because Richard thinks I'm at yoga class right now. Not doing what I was actually doing. The confession hung between them like a live wire. Marcus felt the pieces of a much larger puzzle beginning to shift into focus. What were you doing? He asked quietly. Karen's composure finally shattered. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she pressed her hands to her face. I was paying off someone who could destroy our lives. Someone who knows about the money Richard's been moving through his law firm, money that doesn't belong to his clients anymore. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too public. Marcus glanced around at the other customer students with laptops, business people grabbing quick lunches, all of them blissfully unaware that the woman crying in the corner booth had just confessed to something that sounded like accessory to embezzlement. "Karen," he said slowly, "why are you telling me this?" "Because when that police officer ran my license this morning, it triggered something in their system. Because my husband got a call from someone asking questions about our finances. Because the house of cards we've been living in for the past 3 years is about to collapse. And it's all because I re-rented your stupid car." Her voice had risen enough to draw stares from other customers. Marcus leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "What kind of questions? About property transfers? About shell companies? About why we bought a house worth twice what we could afford on Richard's legitimate income?" Karen wiped her eyes with a napkin, smearing her makeup further. "The FBI has been building a case against Richard's firm for months. They've been watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake that would give them probable cause to dig deeper. And the accident this morning was exactly the kind of mistake they were waiting for." Karen's laugh was bitter. "A public incident that puts me in the system, creates a paper trail, gives them an excuse to start asking official questions about our lifestyle." Marcus felt like he was sinking into quicksand. What had started as a simple insurance claim was apparently the catalyst for bringing down some kind of white-collar crime operation. The absurdity of it would have been funny if Karen didn't look so genuinely terrified. "So when you tried to blame me for the accident, double quotes, he began, "I was desperate. I thought if I could make it your fault, if I could keep the police from filing an official report with my name on it, maybe I could buy us some time." Karen shook her head. "But it's too late now. The report's been filed, the questions have been asked, and Richard knows something's wrong." As if summoned by her words, Karen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and went pale. "He's looking for me," she whispered. "He knows I'm not at yoga." Marcus watched her hands tremble as she stared at the phone. Despite everything she'd put him through that morning, he found himself feeling something uncomfortably close to sympathy. "Karen," he said gently, "if your husband is involved in something illegal, maybe it's better that you don't understand." Her voice was sharp with panic. "Richard doesn't just steal money. He destroys people who threaten him. The man I was paying off this morning, he used to work for the firm. He found out about the missing client funds and tried to report it." She pulled up a photo on her phone and showed it to Marcus. It was a newspaper clipping about a car accident, a single-vehicle crash that had killed a man named David Chen. Marcus's blood went cold. Chen was his last name too, though he was certain this wasn't a relative. But the coincidence felt ominous in a way he couldn't explain. David discovered that Richard had been transferring money from client accounts into investment funds that didn't exist, Karen continued. "When he tried to go to the authorities, he died in what looked like an accident. But his widow found evidence that someone had tampered with his brakes." "Jesus," Marcus breathed. "Why didn't she go to the police?" "She tried, but Richard has connections everywhere, judges, prosecutors, police commissioners. The investigation was closed without charges. David's widow got a settlement that bought her silence, and David became just another tragic accident statistic." The coffee shop felt surreal now, like a movie set where Marcus was being fed lines for a role he'd never auditioned for. "And you think your husband killed this man?" "I know he did." Karen's voice was flat, matter-of-fact, "because I helped him plan it." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Whatever sympathy he'd been feeling evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold understanding of exactly who he was dealing with. "You're confessing to murder," he said quietly. "I'm confessing to being a coward," Karen replied. "I knew what Richard was, what he was capable of, and I helped him anyway because I was too afraid of losing the life we'd built to do the right thing." Her phone buzzed again, and this time she answered it. "Hi, honey," she said, her voice instantly transforming into the bright, artificial tone Marcus had heard that morning. "Yes, I'm just finishing up at the coffee shop. Yoga ran long today." "No, everything's fine. Why would anything be wrong?" She listened for a moment, her face growing paler. "A police report." "What kind of police report? "Oh, that was nothing, just a minor fender bender. Some idiot wasn't watching where he was going." "Yes, I'll be home soon." She ended the call and looked at Marcus with haunted eyes. "He knows about the accident report. He's asking questions about why the police were involved, why there's an official record with my name on it. Maybe you should tell him the truth," Marcus suggested, though even as he said it, he knew how naive it sounded. "The truth." Karen laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. "The truth is that I've been helping my husband launder money stolen from widows and orphans. The truth is that we killed a man to cover it up. The truth is that everything we own, everything we are, is built on blood and stolen money." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "But here's another truth. If Richard thinks I'm becoming a liability, if he thinks I might talk to save myself, I'll end up like David Chen. And if he thinks you know too much about our business, you'll end up the same way." Marcus felt the walls of the coffee shop closing in around him. "Why are you telling me this? Why are you dragging me into your mess?" "Because," Karen said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I think there might be a way out of this. For both of us. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, Karen's phone rang again. This time the caller ID showed a photo of a man in an expensive suit with cold, calculating eyes. Richard Whitmore. Karen stared at the phone like it was a snake, letting it ring twice before answering. Hi, sweetheart, she said, but her voice cracked slightly on the endearment. I was just ... What? No, I haven't seen the news. Why? Marcus watched her face cycle through confusion, shock, and terror as she listened to whatever her husband was telling her. I understand, she said finally. Yes, I'll come home right now. No, I won't talk to anyone. I'll come straight home. She ended the call and sat frozen for a moment, staring at nothing. What is it? Marcus asked. David Chen's widow, Karen whispered. She was found dead this morning. Apparent suicide. She left a note confessing to making false accusations against Richard's firm. The coffee shop seemed to tilt around Marcus. That's impossible. You just told me she had evidence. She did. Karen's voice was hollow. Which means Richard found out about it, which means he's tying up loose ends. She looked directly at Marcus, and he saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. Which means we're both in danger now. The realization hit him like ice water. By involving him in her confession, by meeting with him publicly, Karen had made him a potent. Riverside Park at night was a different world from the family-friendly destination it became during daylight hours. Ancient oak trees cast twisted shadows under the sparse streetlights, and the sound of the river flowing past created a constant whisper that could mask footsteps or muffled conversations. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, his nerves stretched tight as piano wire. He'd spent the afternoon in a haze of disbelief and mounting paranoia, jumping at every car that drove past his house, checking and rechecking the locks on his doors. The rational part of his mind insisted that Karen's story was the desperate fabrication of someone trying to avoid responsibility for a simple traffic accident. But the growing pit in his stomach suggested otherwise. The text message had come from a number that showed no caller ID when he tried to call back. When he'd Googled David Chen's death, he'd found exactly what Karen had described: a brief newspaper article about a tragic single-car accident, followed by an even briefer obituary. And when he'd searched for David's widow, Maria Chen, found a news item from that very morning about an apparent suicide in her apartment. Two people connected to Richard Whitmore's law firm, both dead within months of each other. If it was a coincidence, it was a particularly sinister one. Marcus positioned himself near a cluster of benches that offered a clear view of the north entrance, while keeping his back to the river. At exactly 8 p.m., a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in her 40s with short-cropped gray hair and the kind of alert posture that suggested law enforcement or military training. Marcus Chen, she called softly as she approached. Depends. Who's asking? He replied, though his voice came out shakier than he'd intended. The woman pulled out a badge and held it where he could see it in the dim light. Agent Sarah Torres, FBI Financial Crimes Division. I think we need to have a conversation about the Whitmores. Relief flooded through Marcus so suddenly that his knees nearly buckled. Law enforcement, official channels, people who could actually do something about the nightmare he'd stumbled into. Thank God, he breathed. Karen told me some crazy story about embezzlement and murder, and I didn't know if slow down. Agent Torres interrupted, settling onto the bench beside him. What exactly did Mrs. Whitmore tell you? Marcus recounted the coffee shop conversation, watching Torres's expression grow more serious with each detail. She took notes in a small pad, asking clarifying questions, and occasionally requesting he repeat specific statements. She said David Chen was murdered because he tried to expose Richard's embezzlement, Marcus concluded, and that Maria Chen was killed this morning to cover it up. Torres closed her notepad and studied Marcus's face in the dim light. Mr. Chen, I need you to understand something. Everything you've just told me aligns with an investigation we've been conducting for the past 18 months, but it also puts you in considerable danger. Karen said the same thing. How much danger? Exactly. The kind where people end up dead? Torres's bluntness was jarring. After a day of euphemisms and evasions, Richard Whitmore isn't just an embezzler. He's part of a sophisticated network that launders money for some very dangerous people. People who view murder as a reasonable business expense. Marcus felt the park bench beneath him become suddenly insubstantial. What kind of people? Drug cartels? Mostly. Human traffickers, arms dealers, anyone with large amounts of cash that needs to look legitimate. Torres leaned forward, her voice dropping. Whitmore's law firm provides a perfect front: client accounts, real estate transactions, investment funds. Money goes in dirty and comes out clean, with Richard taking a substantial cut. And when David Chen found out, he became a liability. Same with his wife when she started asking questions about her husband's death. Torres paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. The same way you became a liability the moment Karen Whitmore decided to confess to you. The river's whispers seemed to grow louder, carrying with it the weight of Marcus's new reality. So what happens now? Do I go into witness protection? Do I testify against them? Agent Torres's expression was grim. That's complicated. We don't have enough evidence to arrest Richard yet. and Karen's confession to you isn't admissible in court. It's hearsay unless she's willing to repeat it under oath. Would she do that? Doubtful. Karen Whitmore has been living in luxury for years based on blood money. She's not going to give that up easily, especially not to help a stranger she rear-ended this morning. Marcus stared out at the dark water, processing the implications. So I'm stuck. I know too much to be safe, but not enough to be useful. Not exactly. Torres turned to face him fully. We think there might be a way to use this situation to our advantage, but it would require you to do something extremely dangerous. Before Marcus could ask what she meant, the sound of footsteps on gravel made them both turn. A figure was approaching through the shadows, someone moving with purpose and trying to stay out of the direct light. Torres tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward her jacket. Were you followed here? I don't think so, Marcus replied, but his voice carried uncertainty. I've never done anything like this before. I wouldn't know if the figure stepped into the light, and Marcus's blood turned to ice. It was Richard Whitmore himself, tall and imposing in an expensive overcoat, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. He approached them with the confident stride of someone accustomed to controlling every situation he entered. Agent Torres, he said pleasantly, as if they were meeting at a country club instead of a deserted park. I thought I might find you here. Torres had her weapon halfway out of her holster before Richard raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. Please, Agent, there's no need for dramatics. I'm here to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. Mr. Whitmore, Torres replied, her voice carefully controlled. You're interfering with an ongoing federal investigation, am I? Richard's smile was cold and practiced. From where I stand, it looks like you're harassing an innocent citizen who had the misfortune of being involved in a minor traffic accident. He turned to Marcus, and his eyes were like chips of blue ice. Mr. Chen, isn't it? I understand you've had quite an eventful day. First my wife damages your vehicle, and now you find yourself caught up in what I can only assume are wild conspiracy theories. Marcus found his voice, though it came out smaller than he'd hoped. Your wife told me about David Chen, about Maria Chen, about what you did to them. Richard's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of calculation that suggested he was reassessing the situation. My wife has been under considerable stress lately, he said smoothly. She's been seeing a therapist for anxiety and depression. Sometimes, under pressure, she says things that aren't entirely grounded in reality. Are you saying she made it all up? Marcus challenged, finding some courage in Agent Torres's presence. I am saying that grief makes people see conspiracies where none exist. Richard's voice carried the practiced sympathy of someone delivering bad news to clients. David Chen was a troubled young man who made some poor financial decisions and couldn't live with the consequences. His death was a tragedy, but it was his own choice. What about his wife? Also a tragedy. Maria never recovered from losing David. When she started making wild accusations about our firm, we tried to help her, recommended counselors, offered financial assistance. But ultimately, she chose the same path her husband did. The casual way Richard discussed two deaths made Marcus's skin crawl. This wasn't grief or regret. It was a man reciting a well-rehearsed story designed to deflect responsibility. Mr. Whitmore, Agent Torres interjected. What exactly do you want? Richard's attention shifted to her, and his demeanor became more businesslike. I want to resolve this situation before it spirals out of control. Mr. Chen has been traumatized by a car accident and then subjected to the confused ramblings of my emotionally unstable wife. The last thing he needs is to be dragged into a federal investigation based on hearsay and paranoid fantasies. So you're offering what? Exactly, Torres asked. A fresh start? Richard pulled out a business card and handed it to Marcus. My firm handles personal injury cases, as well as corporate law. I'd be happy to represent Mr. Chen in his claim against our insurance company pro bono, of course. We could have him back on the road with a brand new vehicle by the end of the week. The offer hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus looked at the business card, noting the expensive paper stock and embossed lettering. Richard Whitmore was offering to solve all his immediate problems with a few phone calls and a check, and in exchange, Marcus asked, nothing unreasonable. Simply an acknowledgement that my wife was distraught and not thinking clearly when she spoke to you. That her statements were the product of stress and shouldn't be taken as factual. You want him to recant? Torres said flatly. I want him to tell the truth that a woman having a breakdown said some things that don't reflect reality. Richard's smile was patient, understanding. Surely that's not too much to ask. Marcus felt the weight of both their stares. On one side, a federal agent asking him to risk his life to help bring down a criminal organization. On the other, wealthy lawyer offering to solve his problems in exchange for his silence. What happens if I say no? Marcus stared at his phone for 3 full minutes before dialing Agent Torres's number. When she answered on the first ring, he knew she'd been waiting. I'll do it, he said without preamble. But I want something in return. What's that? I want you to promise me that when this is over, Richard Whitmore will pay for what he did to David and Maria Chen, not just prison. Want him destroyed the same way he destroyed them. There was a pause. Mr. Chen, I can't promise then. Find someone who can, Marcus interrupted. Because I'm not risking my life just to see him plea bargain down to white-collar charges and get out in 5 years. Another pause. Longer this time. Let me make a call. 15 minutes later, Marcus's phone rang again. This time the voice on the other end was different. Told her, with the gravelly tone of someone who'd spent decades in law enforcement. Mr. Chen, this is Deputy Director James Morrison, FBI. Agent Torres tells me you're willing to help us, but you want assurances about the outcome. That's right. I can't promise you specific sentences. That's up to judges and juries. But I can promise you that we have enough evidence to bring RICO charges against Richard Whitmore and his entire organization. If we can get Karen's testimony, we're talking about conspiracy, racketeering, money laundering, and multiple counts of murder. He won't see daylight again. And the people he's laundering money for, that's the real prize, Morrison admitted. Whitmore is small time compared to the cartels he's working with. Your cooperation could help us roll up the entire network. Marcus closed his eyes, thinking about David Chunna, man he'd never met but whose name he shared, whose death had started this whole nightmare. What do you need me to do? The next 4 hours were a crash course in federal investigation techniques. Agent Torres met Marcus at a safe house across town, where technicians fitted him with recording equipment so sophisticated it was virtually undetectable. They rehearsed scenarios, coached him on how to guide conversations, and prepared him for every possible reaction Karen might have. Remember, Torres said as they finished, your job isn't to get a confession. It's to get her talking about the murders in enough detail that we can corroborate her story with physical evidence. What if she doesn't want to talk? She will, Torres replied with certainty. Karen Whitmore is terrified, isolated, and desperate for someone to understand her situation. You're the only person who knows her secret that makes you simultaneously her greatest threat and her only potential ally. At 6 a.m., Marcus called Karen's cell phone. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with exhaustion. Marcus, how did you get this number? You gave it to me yesterday. Remember? At the coffee shop. Marcus tried to keep his voice casual despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Listen, I've been thinking about what you told me, and I need to ask you some questions. I can't talk about that anymore, Karen said quickly. Richard, he's been watching me. I think he knows we met yesterday. That's exactly why we need to talk. Meet me at the construction site on Elm Street in an hour. It's public enough to be safe, but private enough for us to speak freely. There was a long pause. Why would you want to help me? Because Marcus said, surprised to find he meant it. I don't think you're a killer, Karen. I think you're someone who got in too deep and doesn't know how to get out. Another pause. 1 hour and Marcus. If this is some kind of trap, it's not. He lied. I just want to understand what really happened. The construction site was perfect for their purposes, dozens of workers, creating enough ambient noise to mask their conversation, while the FBI surveillance team could position themselves among the legitimate observers and inspectors who frequented such sites. Karen arrived precisely on time, looking haggard and jumpy. She'd attempted to maintain her usual polished appearance, but the cracks were showing. Her makeup couldn't quite hide the dark circles under her eyes, and her hand shook slightly as she approached. Thank you for coming, Marcus said, guiding her to a quiet corner near a stack of steel beams. I shouldn't be here, Karen replied, glancing around nervously. If Richard finds out, tell me about David Chen, Marcus said gently. What really happened to him? Karen's composure cracked immediately. I told you yesterday Richard killed him. But at WASN single quotes T. It wasn't supposed to happen that way. What was it supposed to be? Tears began flowing down Karen's cheeks. David had discovered the money transfers. Richard tried to buy him off first, offered him a partnership, a raise, anything to keep him quiet. But David he was principled. He said he had a duty to the clients whose money Richard had stolen. So Richard decided to kill him. Richard decided to ruin him first. He planted evidence that David was the one embezzling money, set him up to take the fall for everything. But David was smarter than we expected. He'd kept copies of everything. Hidden evidence that proved Richard was behind it all. Karen wiped her eyes, smearing her makeup further. The night David died, he'd called Richard, said he was going to the FBI the next morning, unless Richard confessed and made restitution to all the clients. He gave him 12 hours to do the right thing, and instead, Richard had him killed. Richard called his his contacts. People he'd been laundering money for. They had specialists who could make things look like accidents. Karen's voice dropped to a whisper. They tampered with David's brakes, made it look like a mechanical failure. The police barely investigated, just wrote it off as bad luck. Marcus felt sick, but he pressed on. What about Maria? Why kill her? She never believed the official story. She kept pushing, asking questions, demanding to see David's files from the firm. Richard managed to delay her for months, but eventually, she found David's hidden evidence. What kind of evidence? Bank records, wire transfer receipts, emails between Richard and the money laundering contacts. Everything needed to prove that David was trying to expose the crime, not commit it. Karen sobbed quietly. Maria called Richard last week, said she was going to the media if he didn't confess to David's murder, so he had her killed too. It was supposed to look like suicide, the grieving widow who couldn't live without her husband. Richard's people broke into her apartment, forced her to write a confession saying she'd lied about him, then they made it look like she'd overdosed on sleeping pills. The recording equipment hidden in Marcus's jacket captured every word, every sob, every damning detail. But as he listened to Karen's confession, Marcus found himself genuinely moved by her anguish. She might be complicit in murder, but she was also clearly tortured by what she'd helped enable. Karen, he said softly, you know this has to stop, right? Richard is going to keep killing people to protect his secret. How many more David and Maria Chens have to die? You don't understand, Karen replied desperately. I can't testify against him. If I do, he'll have me killed too. And even if I survive long enough to testify, his contacts have reach everywhere. Judges, prosecutors, police. They'll find a way to discredit me or make the evidence disappear. What if I told you there was a way to make sure Richard couldn't hurt anyone else? A way to make sure justice actually gets served? Karen looked at him with desperate hope. How? Marcus took a deep breath, knowing he was about to cross a line he could never uncross. The FBI has been investigating Richard for 18 months. They have most of the pieces, but they need someone on the inside to confirm their theories and provide testimony that can't be dismissed. The hope in Karen's eyes died instantly, replaced by terror. You're working with them. This is a setup. Yes, Marcus admitted, but not the kind of setup you think. I'm not trying to trap you, Karen. I'm trying to save you. By getting me killed. By giving you a chance to do the right thing before it's too late. Marcus leaned forward, his voice urgent. Richard is cleaning house. David and Maria are dead. How long do you think it'll be before he decides you're too much of a liability? Karen stared at him, the truth of his words sinking in. He's already started watching me more closely, asking where I've been, checking my phone, ... Then, you know I'm right. Your only chance is to help the FBI bring him down before he decides to eliminate you too. For a long moment, the only sound was the construction noise around them. Hammering, shouting, the rumble of heavy machinery. Karen sat frozen, clearly wrestling with the impossible choice between certain death and uncertain survival. If I cooperate, she said finally, what happens to me? You'll probably do some prison time, Marcus admitted, but you'll be alive to serve it, and you'll have the chance to make amends for what you've done. Karen laughed bitterly. Amends. How do you make amends for helping murder innocent people? By making sure their deaths weren't meaningless. By ensuring that Richard faces justice, and that his organization gets destroyed. Another long silence, then Karen pulled out her phone and stared at it. He's been texting me all morning, she said quietly. Wants to know where I am, who I'm with. He's never been this controlling before because he's scared, Marcus replied. For the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore isn't in complete control of a situation. Karen looked up at him, and Marcus saw something new in her expression, not hope, exactly, but a kind of desperate determination. If I do this, she said, I want immunity for my Tay.